So imagine you're standing on the edge of a frozen Alaskan valley at dusk. The wind's cutting across the tundra, the light's fading, and the land feels enormous, ancient, almost untouched. Only 160,000 acres out of 365 million acres of Alaska has been developed. Imagine you're in a part barely mapped and completely unexplored. And then on the distant ridge you see movement, something massive, shaggy and broad-backed. It has two curved shapes that rise above its head. And for a moment you think, that looks like a mastodon or a mammoth. Now, if mammoths went extinct 11,000 years ago, what'd you see? Because the Ice Age is not some mythic prehistoric fairy tale, it ended roughly 11,700 years ago. Humans were already here. Our ancestors walked among mammoths, mastodons, giant bison, American lions, short-faced bears, and ground sloths the size of trucks. And yet reports continue. Mammoth-like silhouettes in Alaska, elephant-like tracks that were described in the 1700s, giant bears bigger than polar bears described in the Arctic regions, massive ground sloth creatures in the Amazon, and wild cavemen in remote North American and Canadian forests. So if extinction was complete, biologically complete, then why do these sightings persist? Hey everyone, I'm Mike Porter. Welcome to Arcane Station. And tonight we're going to be talking obviously about megafauna and why there are still reports being seen worldwide actually, but a lot of them that take place in the Canadian and American Arctic regions. So we're going to try to figure out what's going on and why people are seeing what they're seeing. And to do that, what we're going to do is first we're going to stop and talk about just the Pleistocene, the history of megafauna, specifically in North America, but in the Americas and worldwide actually. So the Pleistocene epoch lasted from about 2.6 million years ago until roughly 11,700 years ago. And it was defined by repeated glacial cycles, so like massive ice sheets advancing and retreating all across the northern hemisphere. But what makes the Pleistocene truly remarkable isn't just the ice, it's the animals. So when we say megafauna, we're really talking about large-bodied animals. And their explanation, the scientific explanation, is anything over about 44 kilograms or roughly 100 pounds. Well, I've seen some dogs over 100 pounds, and I wouldn't really call it megafauna. So let's say around 500 pounds. Let's start there. So this includes elephants, rhinos, bisons, bear, and big cats. And they were the giants of the ecosystem. And what's interesting is that megafauna didn't disappear everywhere. So Africa still has elephants and rhinos and lions and buffalo and giraffe and hippos. So those are all megafauna. Africa retained almost all of its large animals. But after the Ice Age, Australia lost roughly 88% of its megafauna, and the Americas lost over 70%. And some of those creatures we didn't lose, but they changed over time to become smaller. Europe even experienced the same thing as well. They had megafauna, and then their population collapsed as well. There's still obviously red stag deer, which are massive. That would be considered megafauna. So extinction for these creatures wasn't a uniform process. It was basically selective. It's like, what would this environment hold or maintain a population of based on what they had available to them in terms of the dietary requirements, what predators were around, and why those numbers changed dramatically over a variety of locations is because sometimes a population or an environment needs all of the different pieces, predator, prey, and those hierarchies to ensure that the environment is well taken care of. So that's why you still have all of those creatures in Africa, because It's largely, most of it's uninhabited. There is tribes people all over Africa, but smaller populations. Much like prior to colonists coming to the United States, there were isolated pockets of indigenous people here, and the population of creatures was much different. Large herds of bison and all of this other stuff that was just out, sort of living in the environment, and what they were doing was providing a service to the ecology of the environment. So, like I said, this extinction wasn't uniform, it was selective. And what vanished were not all the large animals, but the extremes. So the upper ceiling of size and diversity collapsed. In North America in particular, underwent a biological transformation that would almost be unrecognizable to us today. So if you step back 15,000 years ago and looked around, it would feel pretty alien. And humans overlapped with that world. So there was archaeological evidence that humans were present in North America at least 14,000 years ago, if not possibly sooner or earlier. So mammoths survived on the mainland until roughly 11,000 years ago. So that's a 4,000 year gap or overlap. So that means that humans were either a predator or prey for these massive creatures. And when they were gone, these creatures, perhaps their extinction left not just ecological scars, but psychological ones, encoded culturally and behaviorally, and maybe even epigenetically. So you've heard about inherited traumas. There are people that still have, or even animals you see, if something bad happened to a parent, genetically they pass down that information to its offspring, and those either animals or people have a visceral reaction to whatever it was, traumatic experience was that happened to their parent, even without knowing what happened to them. So there is some evidence that we, in our DNA, some of this code is written about what is in the past, and it's carried forward through our DNA. So the dominant scientific explanation for the megafauna extinction event is a combination of climate change and human pressure, because the humans were obviously trying to make sure that they could survive big cats and things of that nature, including eating. So they would capture something or kill something and feed the group. So the hunting that was taking place, humans are obviously very small compared to an elephant, but when you get 20 or 30 people with spears, perhaps that was enough pressure for those elephants to not survive the encounter. So as the last ice age ended, warming temperatures altered the habitats, and at the same time, humans became highly efficient hunters, and they spread across the new continent. So this overkill hypothesis, combined with environmental stress, is widely accepted as the primary cause for this extinction event. But extinction isn't just a switch that gets flipped. Basically what happens is that the population of these creatures thins, it fragments, and then it isolates these different populations, and it pushes species into ecological corners until eventually they disappear. And the word disappear actually is even misleading. Species don't vanish instantly. The fossil record captures the last evidence that we've found, but it doesn't necessarily capture the last individual. So what do I mean by that? You look at the Thylacine, and I'll talk about a little bit about that later, but the Thylacine is the Tasmanian tiger. And the last known surviving Tasmanian tiger died off in the 1920s, or so they think. And so in order for a population to stop existing, there has to be the last of. And that could be whatever the lifespan of that creature is, distance from the rest of the population. So there is an outlier in every aspect of an extinction event, and the last known becomes the one that people can truly say that that's it. However, there is some evidence that there are relic remote sightings of the thylacine. Okay, so we'll come back to that. So, like I said, humans walked among these things, and the extinction happened within the time span of human history, and therefore we know that culturally somehow we have a memory of this event. But if we're going to talk about extinction and relics and sightings, we need to understand just how radically different North and South America once were. So people, when they hear about Ice Age animals, they tend to just picture mammoths, but we had a massive roster here in the United States. So there were, or actually in the Americas, North America had multiple species of proboscideans, which is basically elephant relatives. There were Columbian mammoths, which roamed much of the continent, including and particularly the open plains. Woolly mammoths were in the colder regions, so Alaska, Canada, and at the edges of the glacial ice. And then there were American mastodons, which preferred forested habitats and wetlands, so they were sort of smaller and able to get through the trees much more effectively. So mammoths and mastodons were not the same animal. A lot of people think they were. Mammoths were more grassland adapted, and mastodons browsed trees and shrubs. And they filled an ecological niche that simply doesn't exist like it did previously. Mainland mammoths disappeared from the fossil record roughly 11,000 years ago. And what's interesting is that a small population of mammoths survived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic until about 4,000 years ago. That means these mammoths were alive while ancient civilizations were already thriving elsewhere. So extinction clearly is not a single synchronized event, like a massive meteor comes down and destroys everything. This was a slow process of elimination over time. In the 17 and 1800s, massive bones were found in places like Big Bone Lick in Kentucky and across the Ohio River Valley. So early American naturalists weren't sure that extinction even happened for these creatures because they were finding the bones. Thomas Jefferson himself speculated that mammoths might still roam the unexplored western territories, because if you think about when the founding of America, there was this just isolation along the eastern seaboard, and it wasn't until later that they actually started expanding outwards. And they had conversations with the indigenous people, and they were saying that there were still creatures out there that looked like mammoths or mastodons. So this wasn't fringe thinking that there could be something out there. It was actually just honest scientific uncertainty. Something else that people probably don't realize is that camels actually originated in North America. The genus Camelops lived here during the Pleistocene. These were large, long-legged camels that inhabited open grasslands in arid regions, and they vanished around the same times as mammoths. Today, camels feel foreign to an American landscape, but during the Ice Age, they were native. Imagine looking across what is now Nevada or Arizona and seeing herds of camels moving across the plains. That was normal. Now imagine someone today seeing a large, unfamiliar ungulate silhouette at the distance in a desert region. They would be like, what is that? I don't know what that is. North America also had Panthera atrox, which is the much larger than the African lion. It was an American lion. It's one of the largest cats to ever live. And we also had Smilodon, which was the saber-toothed cat, saber-toothed tiger. It was stocky and powerful and an ambush predator with elongated canines. Jaguars once ranged much further north today than jaguars were almost all over the United States, and only later through population increase were they pushed back into South America. And there's still reports to this day of jaguars sometimes in Texas or in desert lands in the Southwest. So in low light and wilderness conditions, scales of creatures can distort. And, when you look at a large cougar at a distance, it can appear far larger than it truly is, and cougars can get massive. The heaviest recorded cougar weighed 276 pounds. And this is a report from the National Park Service. So some reports and old records mention this massive size, but they don't tell where the specific location for this is. They don't want people actually going out, I guess, and just trying to hunt down these massive creatures. But the guess is that it's either from Canada or western U.S., but a 276-pound mountain lion is massive, and it would be terrifying to see. We also had this creature called the Arctidus simus, which is the short-faced bear, and this bear was built differently from modern bears. It had longer legs. The term used for those longer legs is cursorial, which means that it has limbs structured or adapted for running for distances or high speed. So this is a 12-foot tall bear. Even on all fours, it would have looked enormous. Its shoulder height was around 5 to 6 feet while it was down on all fours. And modern brown bears are already massive. Some of those can exceed up to 1,200 pounds. But this short-faced bear was around 2,200 pounds. So they had, I can imagine that being just extremely terrifying to see double the size of a grizzly bear coming at you with really long legs, and it had a short snout, so very basically boxer-like snout, so very truncated. We also had giant bison, so these were not the modern bison, which are already massive. The bison that I'm talking about would have had a horde span of about 6 feet from tip to tip, and they were 7.5 feet tall at the shoulder and 15 feet long, and they weighed about 3,500 pounds, so basically the size of a van with horns. That would have been terrifying to see as well. And then we have dire wolves. So those are more robust than modern gray wolves, and they were more closely related to jackals than wolves. However, they had heavier builds and more powerful jaws than current wolves do, and they were specialized hunters that went after camels and horses and bison. So what remains today are smaller, leaner descendants or an ecological replacement. And once the camels and the giant bison were gone, their numbers dwindled. And then we have the giant ground sloth. Now this is the weirdest one of all, and this is in South America. There's species like the megatherium or the mylodon, which reached enormous sizes. And some had osteoderms, which are basically small bony plates embedded underneath their skin, reinforcing their hide, so they were not something easy to kill. And these were massive terrestrial herbivores. They would stand upright and pull trees down, and they could be 12 to 14 feet tall and several 1,500, 1,600 pounds. And in Brazil and Argentina, people are finding these enormous tunnel systems now called paleoburrows, and basically they believe to have been dug out by giant sloths, and some of them are over 100 feet long. And humans overlap with these animals. So we have physically entered spaces that they've carved into the earth, and that makes that extinction feel tangible because they're no longer there. So if we had all of these things, all within a time window that overlaps the human presence, it becomes not an ancient myth, it's like ecological history. So when somebody reports something that feels like it should be in the Ice Age, that idea doesn't feel completely impossible. Because if we move to whether any of these things could still exist, we need to ground this in documented reports. So named cases, dates, specific claims. If somebody said they saw something, let's find out about it and see if there's a possibility that it could actually be there. There's this obviously this isn't proof, but there are reports. So one of them, let's just start with bears. So there's a cryptid sighting of bears. The first one is a Bergman's bear, and this happened in the Kamchatka region of Russia. And basically, so Bergman was a zoologist in the 1920s, and they think he found this cryptid bear reported in Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula, and basically it was described as a 2,500-pound bear with short black fur and a massive 14.5 by 10-inch track, and it was distinguished from the local bears that were well known. So there's this concept of Irkurium, which is basically translates roughly to trousers pulled down, because this bear looked really strange. It looked like it basically had its pants around its ankle, the way that the fur was reported. But it described it as a massive dark-furred bear, often seen walking upright. And they feel like this could be a short-faced bear, but I think because they're talking about the way that the back legs looked, that doesn't match up with a longer-limbed, short-faced bear, so it could be a genetic aberration or a different species entirely that they just can't find. So there's been no confirmed sightings since the 1920s. However, the Bergman's bear was killed and skinned, and the pelt was taken back as evidence of this creature. I don't know that they've actually done any additional genetic or DNA sampling, and I think part of that actually goes away because when you do the tanning process, it removes some of that DNA structure. There's also been this concept of a giant polar bear. So polar bears are massive anyway, but this is supposed to be significantly larger than average polar bears. They call it white mass bears, and basically they claim that the bears drove the residents away. One of the things that they talked about was Portlock being an area where people were killed and drove away from, but there's also Bigfoot reports in the same area, so I feel like that one's kind of up in the air about which creature actually engaged with the people in that space. And then you have the Nandi bear, and this is in Kenya in 1910, and it was like really low to the ground, but its back shoulder was about 4 to 5 feet high. It had long, shaggy hair, no tail, and a sloping back. Then you had the short-faced bear sightings. They call it a bulldog bear in the Northwest Territories in Alberta, and they basically think that this is where the greatest possibility of the short-faced bear is, being seen. And then you have the Kyushu bear from Japan, which is like a 1 meter tall bear. So standing on their hind legs, they would have been maybe like 5 feet tall, so fairly small. And then we have these reports of American elephants. So natives basically, or people were saying that these were hairy elephants, and they've been reported for centuries around the Alaskan and Canadian wilderness. So sightings range from 16th century explorers to 19th century gold rush people, like prospectors going out. So David Ingram in the 16th century reported seeing elephants and hearing of hairy beasts with large teeth, and this was in 1567 to 1568. In the 18th and 19th century, Native American tribes, including the Ponca and the Omaha, shared oral traditions of massive elephant-like animals in the Great Plains. In 1811, David Thompson from Canada was shown a massive, unfamiliar track in the Canadian wilderness, which indigenous people attributed to this hairy elephant creature. And during the gold rush era in the 1800s, newspapers such as the Portland Press in 1896 published accounts from prospectors claiming to see living mammoths in the Yukon and Alaska. And in the 20th century, sporadic, unverified reports of shaggy, dark lumps suggestive of mammoths continued in the boreal forests of Alaska and Canada. And this is similar to Russian reports. So, and then the Siberian sightings throughout the 1900s, reports emerged from the Siberian wilderness. In 1920, a French diplomat recorded a trapper's story of a giant, shaggy, elephant-like creature in the Taiga. And this was in another one in 1982. A Soviet journalist received accounts of Obda, which is locally the name for mammoths, in far eastern Europe, so basically the Caucasus Mountains in that region. And it was said to move in herds and protect their young. Now, going to South America, we have the Mapinguari. And there's been some speculation that the Mapinguari was actually a Bigfoot creature, but when the primitive people, the indigenous people, who had not had any contact with the outside world, so no telephone, no internet, none of that stuff. They said that they had this creature that would come in and tear things up and then leave, and they tried to hit it with their bow and arrow, but many times the arrows would just bounce off. And when scientists showed them different pictures like Gigantopithecus, and the only one that they said that this Mapinguari was the giant tree or giant ground sloth. So it's a massive, foul-smelling bipedal creature with long hair, and occasionally features a single eye or mouth on its stomach, which makes no sense. But this is the sightings, and it's a 7-foot-plus tall creature. So in the 1970s to 2000s, numerous accounts from the Jura Puris and Madeira rivers detail sightings of a large, dark figure at dusk, alongside reports of loud guttural or whistling roars that differ from known animal calls. And then in 1975, Jamaican River, a worker named Mario Padilla de Souza reported encountering a two-legged, smelly giant creature with sharp claws, matching the descriptions of a giant ground sloth. And then in 1993, John Bautista Ovado reported a massive bipedal creature that stared at him before emitting a raw scream and fleeing. So there's a bunch of reports, recent reports, 2005, 2007, 2014. So there's some physical evidence. They have tracks along the trees that have been bent or ripped, and strange noises like the howling and stuff like that that's been recorded. But there's no physical evidence other than that. There's no body or no shed or any of that stuff. So I'm not going to go too far into this because this would be delving into the Bigfoot territory, but there's also been reports of cavemen creatures throughout Quebec, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. So, and there's been sightings of them from helicopter and in the distance. So this isn't just isolated events. And then obviously there's the thylacine I talked about before. So basically it was presumed to be extinct. However, there's been some occasional trail cam footages that shows up, and the earliest or the latest in the 2020s. So they believe that this creature may still be here, still be around. So now obviously it would be very difficult for these creatures to survive because there's very little habitation for them that have been damaged. So if you figure an elephant was foraging and tramping, you would see broken vegetation or massive trails where they were moving around. Bears are a little bit more isolated and don't have as much ecological damage because they're just taking a kill, and they're not tearing up the environment like an elephant would. However, there would still be carcasses and stuff to be found. There's obviously difficulty in understanding why there isn't physical evidence of these things. And there's a few reasons for that. So, let's just say this: population mechanics. Let me do this first. Population would be very difficult, right? So they would have to have a large group to survive. So they would have to have a breeding population. That mammoth group that survived on the island, they indicated very heavily inbreeding and physical deformities because of that inbreeding. So they need to have a large population to ensure that there's no genetic damage over time. There would need to be a herd, right? So they would have to have a vast grazing territory, significant vegetation consumption. So it's difficult to see, specifically in mammoth reports, how that would be possible for them to still be here, right? There's a huge ecological footprint. There would be environmental DNA. So if you grab a piece of the ground and send it off to a lab and look for what has crossed paths with that piece of land, you should find all the DNA evidence that has of any animal that's gone through that area, and they're just not finding it. Now, animals die, obviously. Even rare animals die, and people would sometimes see them, right? Like see carcasses and stuff like that. But if we go looking for bodies and we don't find them, that doesn't necessarily mean that the animal's not there, because it's almost impossible to find a bear skeleton in the wild. It's almost impossible. So animal carcasses and skeletons are like really difficult to find because there's a multi-stage recycling process, and it's driven by scavengers and environmental factors. So a carcass would attract foxes and bears and coyotes and wolves and vultures and insects, right? And the larger scavengers often consume the meat, hair, and soft tissue quickly, and can even consume or scatter the bones. So a body is broken up pretty efficiently just by a large predator. And then you have bone consumption. So even after the flesh is gone, animals don't last long. Rodents like mice and squirrels, even deer, will gnaw on the bones to obtain a calcium and nutrients. And in really acidic soils, bones rot or break down into soil really quickly. So rain, snow, and freeze-thaw cycles can break down bones and turn them into smaller pieces that blend into the environment, and wind and water can move, bury, or wash away skeletons. A lot of times animals go to a location, bury themselves into a hollow or a burrow, and then die. There's talks of, even in Africa, of elephant graveyards where they travel massive amounts of distance to go hide somewhere to die, and it took forever for them to find one. So even with elephants' deaths, it was difficult to find the ones that died naturally, because they would go to a place where they would die in peace or hide. And then there's microbial decomposition in warmer weather, and that can turn a carcass into basically a puddle within days, right? So there's lots of stuff that could take place. Vines can grow over something, leaves can fall over the top of it, so it's difficult to find bodies. Now, in paleontology, there's this idea of Signer-Lips effect, and basically it's really important. The fossil record does not capture the exact moment a species goes extinct. So it captures the last fossil that we found, but that's not the same thing. So, like I was saying before, with the thylacine, 1920s was the last known one because that was the one in captivity. And if we were to capture that in fossil record, that would just be the last one that we know about. But if there's more out in the wilds of Tasmania, then perhaps later on we'll find another fossil that indicates that another one had lived longer than the last one in captivity. And like I said before, the Wrangel Island incident, that's the mastodons or the mammoths. It was like this staggered destruction over time of these creatures. So, it's difficult like I always say, I believe people when they report something. I think they've truly seen something. And so here's where my mind goes, and I'm not sure how this is plausible, but I'm just going to lay it out for you. I've talked about time slips before. I've talked about quantum processes and the many minds and the many worlds thesis, which is basically when you think of something, that becomes a timeline, and there's multiple timelines, and one of them gets collapsed into your reality. And what happens to those other timelines? Do those also collapse into other realities, or are they just discarded? That part I don't know. But let's imagine, for instance, that my timeline, I decide to run for president, and then another timeline, I decide to be a criminal. Do both of those timelines play out next to each other, but invisible to each other? And so that's where my mind kind of goes with this, is that perhaps, and I'm not saying that our minds made the extinction event happen. What I'm saying is that perhaps there is a timeline that those creatures are still alive. And if so, then could there also be a portaling event? And I talked about this in the science of the paranormal. Could we just be seeing a glimpse of that other reality? Because our senses are so limited that perhaps when things intersect slightly, we get a glimpse into that other reality, into that other dimension. I believe that's a possibility. I also believe in time slips, there's people that talked about showing up in some location, describing it completely, and then coming back and finding out later on that that's actually how the place used to look 100 years ago. So is it possible in nature that you're also getting these portals or energy spikes that causes these time slips to occur? I think that's a possibility. I don't want people to think that my mind completely goes to the paranormal and the esoteric immediately for everything. I do try to think about things in a scientific way, but that's why we went through all of the DNA evidence and all that other information. We wanted to see if there's a possibility that could happen. And it's highly unlikely that they are still around. So that's when my mind says, well, if that's not true, then how do we resolve people's truths with reality? And that's where I come up with this visual portal, or a time slip, or dimensions rubbing up against each other, where one timeline the animals still exist and another timeline they don't. And there's infinite realities based on quantum information. Now, again, I don't know if reality collapses when we visualize it, and if each person's reality is the same, or if it's slightly different and we're able to see it because we cohabitate a space and we can discuss ideas together, and how certain people's reality makes them look at the world one way and another person's reality makes them look at the world a different way. We have two different points of view in the same space, so perhaps our realities are completely different from each other's, but shared in ways that aren't critical to ourselves, if that makes sense. All right, so I have rambled on enough. I think people are just seeing glimpses into the past in very isolated moments. That's why sometimes the tracks aren't seen. That's why sometimes they can't find a body. Although there are some times, like the Bergman's bear, where they do find and capture and kill a specimen. But the science of the 1920s is not the science of the 2026s. So if perhaps another one of these creatures gets taken and the DNA evidence proves that it was something other than what we currently have, I think there's conversations about how we go about finding out more about those things, like conservation. There's a good show, and I can't remember the guy's name, but there's a good show that this guy's going out looking for previously thought to be extinct animals. And he's constantly on Joe Rogan's podcast, and I wish I could remember his name. Anyway, he has a show that talks about that he believes there's creatures around, and one of those that he believes in is the megalodon. So I think it's interesting that a scientist is actually looking into thought to be extinct animals, and I think that's where we need to start. And if he finds it, awesome. And if he doesn't, that brings me back to my concept of this view into a different reality. All right, that's all I have. If you've enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe. If you would like to hear something specifically in the show, some concept or idea that you want me to talk about, I am happy to do so. Send me an email, mike@arcane-station.com, mike@arcane-station.com. Look forward to hearing from you. Have a wonderful evening.